The grand ballroom shimmered under the golden chandeliers. The air smelled of expensive perfume, fine wine, and polished wood. Elegant guests in designer suits and gowns filled the room, their conversations blending into a soft hum. Laughter echoed from different corners as waiters moved gracefully, refilling glasses and serving delicate appetizers. This was the annual Gala, an exclusive event attended by the wealthy and influential. It was a place for connections, business deals, and silent judgments. Every year, the same faces returned, greeting each other with familiar nods and polite smiles. Then James walked in. He was tall, well-dressed in a tailored black suit, and carried himself with quiet confidence. His deep brown skin stood out in the sea of lighter complexions. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the stares, some subtle, others not. He wasn't surprised. He was used to it. Some guests glanced at him with curiosity, their expressions unreadable. Others barely acknowledged him, dismissing him as unimportant. A few exchanged whispers, their voices low, but not low enough. James ignored it and moved towards his table. He greeted the guests already seated. "Good evening," he said, offering a polite smile. Some returned the greeting with forced politeness. Others only nodded, their smiles thin. A man in a navy suit looked him up and down before exchanging a glance with the woman beside him. James took his seat, unbothered on the surface. But he knew what was happening. He had seen it before. Judgment disguised as politeness, curiosity laced with arrogance. The gala continued around him, but he could already feel it. The weight of their expectations, the silent test they had placed before him. And soon, they would make it obvious. The conversation at the table carried on, but James could sense the shift. A woman with pearl earrings leaned closer to the man beside her, whispering something behind her glass of champagne. The man smirked, his eyes flickering toward James before quickly looking away. Another man, older with silver hair and a sharp suit, cleared his throat and spoke loudly enough for James to hear. "Didn't expect to see such diversity at this event," he said, swirling his drink. A few chuckled. Some remained silent. James didn't react. He simply took a sip of water, maintaining his composed expression. The silver-haired man smiled, waiting for a response. When he got none, he shrugged and turned to someone else, as if dismissing James altogether. Another guest, a woman with diamonds around her wrist, glanced at James's suit. "That's a nice suit," she said, her tone light but laced with something else. "Custom-made, I assume?" James nodded. "Yes." She raised an eyebrow, then turned to the man beside her. "It must be so inspiring, don't you think, seeing how opportunities have expanded for, well, everyone." Her smile was sweet, but the words were sharp. A few at the table chuckled again. James knew this game too well. These weren't direct insults. No one was calling him out openly. Instead, it was quiet mockery, hidden beneath polite words and feigned curiosity. It was exclusion disguised as conversation. James remained calm, his posture steady. He had been in rooms like this before. He had heard these kinds of comments before. He wouldn't let them shake him. But he knew, it was only going to get worse. The night was just getting started. The gala continued. Speeches were given, glasses clinked, and laughter filled the room. The atmosphere was light, but James knew the undercurrents beneath the surface. He could feel the eyes that still lingered on him. Then, a well-known businessman, Richard Langley, took the microphone. He was an older man with a booming voice, known for his wealth and influence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his smile wide, his confidence effortless. "What a fantastic evening we're having. It's always a pleasure to see such successful individuals gathered in one place." There were nods of approval, a few scattered claps. Richard glanced around the room, his eyes briefly settling on James. "And of course," he continued, chuckling, "it's refreshing to see that our guest list is becoming more inclusive." The crowd laughed. Some genuinely, some awkwardly. Others simply smirked. James felt the weight of the joke settle over him. The words were light, almost innocent, but the message was clear. Another guest leaned toward his friend and whispered, "Did you hear that? He's talking about—" "I know," the other replied, shaking his head, stifling a laugh. Richard wasn't done. "I mean, really," he continued, grinning, "when I started in this industry, people like me worked for decades just to get a seat at this table. Now, it seems like times are changing. Fast." More laughter. Louder this time. Some people clapped, others exchanged glances, unsure whether to join in. James didn't smile. He didn't frown either. He simply stared, his expression unreadable. The businessman moved on to another topic, leaving the joke behind as if it had never been said. But James knew, everyone in that room had heard it. Some had laughed, some had stayed silent, and some, for the first time that night, had begun to feel uncomfortable. James sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly. The night had finally revealed itself. And soon, he would too. The laughter faded, but the weight of the joke lingered. Some guests moved on, sipping their drinks and resuming their conversations. Others stole quick glances at James, waiting for a reaction. James remained still, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of his glass. He had heard worse in his life. This was nothing new. But not everyone ignored what had happened. The event's host, a distinguished older gentleman named Mr. Caldwell, stood near the stage. His expression was neutral, but his eyes flickered with something else, perhaps unease. After a brief pause, he stepped forward, adjusting his suit jacket. Taking the microphone, he smiled warmly at the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "what a night it has been. We've heard from some of the most respected voices in this room. But before we continue, I'd like to invite someone new to speak." The room quieted slightly, heads turning in curiosity. "James," Mr. Caldwell continued, looking directly at him, "would you mind joining us for a few words?" A ripple of surprise spread across the tables. Some guests raised their brows, others exchanged amused looks. James met Mr. Caldwell's gaze. He could tell, the invitation was not a setup. It was an opportunity. For a brief second, he considered refusing. Staying silent would be easier. Letting the night pass without confrontation would be simpler. But James had never chosen the easy path. He pushed back his chair and stood. The room seemed even quieter now. He adjusted his suit, took a deep breath, and walked toward the stage. As he stepped up, he could feel the weight of 100 stares, some indifferent, some expectant, some doubtful. At the front table, Richard Langley leaned back in his chair, smirking slightly, as if waiting to be entertained. James reached the microphone. He let his eyes scan the audience, taking in their faces. He placed both hands on the podium and inhaled deeply. Then, in a steady, calm voice, he began to speak. James looked out at the crowd, his expression steady. The room had fallen silent. Some watched with genuine curiosity, others with skepticism. A few, like Richard Langley, leaned back in their seats, smirking, expecting a weak response or an uncomfortable stumble. James took a deep breath and spoke. "First, I'd like to thank Mr. Caldwell for inviting me to this stage," he said. His voice was smooth, controlled. "And of course, I'd like to thank all of you for allowing me a moment of your time." A few polite nods, a few unreadable expressions. James let the silence settle for a second before continuing. "This evening has been interesting," he said with a small smile, his eyes scanning the room. "I've had the pleasure of meeting some incredible people. I've also had the pleasure of hearing some fascinating conversations." There were a few chuckles, nervous, uncertain. Others simply watched, waiting to see where this was going. "But one thing stood out to me tonight," James continued, his voice still calm, but carrying a quiet weight. "And that's the way people react to someone they don't expect to see in certain places." The room tensed slightly. James kept his tone steady. "You see, I've spent my entire life walking into rooms where I wasn't expected, classrooms, boardrooms, conferences, and yes, events like this one." He glanced at Richard Langley, just briefly, "and every time I see the same expressions. Some are curious, some are dismissive, and some are amused." He let that sit for a moment. A few guests shifted in their seats. James continued, "I've heard the jokes, the whispers, the quiet questions about how I got here, if I belong here, and I know I'm not the only one who has experienced that." A hush spread through the audience. Some looked away. Others stared at him with new attention. "But here's the thing," James said, his voice firm now. "Success is not a club with a locked door. Hard work, intelligence, resilience, these things are not assigned to any one group of people. And I am living proof of that." He could see it. The shift in the room. Some faces softened, others looked uncomfortable. He wasn't finished yet. He had their attention now, and he was about to change the entire atmosphere of the night. James let the silence stretch for a moment, letting his words settle in the room. He could see the tension in people's faces. Some were still skeptical. Others, though, were beginning to listen, really listen. He took a slow breath and continued. I know some of you came here tonight expecting to see the usual faces, hear the usual speeches, and enjoy a comfortable evening. I know that for some of you, my presence might have felt unexpected. He saw a few heads nod slightly, almost unconsciously. He saw others lower their gazes, shifting in their seats. But I also know that this is not just about me, James said, his voice steady, because history has shown us something very clear. Progress is always uncomfortable at first. He let that sink in. There was a time when people doubted that women could lead businesses. He gestured toward a few successful women in the room. A time when people doubted that certain families, certain backgrounds could produce great minds. James paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. And yet, here we are. The weight of his words settled over the crowd. The truth is, people like me weren't expected in rooms like this. Not because we weren't capable, but because the world had already decided where we belonged. Silence. James saw the shift, indifference fading into thoughtfulness, maybe even understanding. But exclusion doesn't stop progress, he said firmly. It never has. It never will. The world changes whether we're ready for it or not. Richard Langley shifted, his smirk gone. James met his gaze, then looked around the room. I'm not an exception, he said calmly. I'm proof. Proof that talent, intelligence, and resilience exist everywhere. The whispers had stopped. The laughter was gone. James exhaled, steadying himself. He had said what needed to be said, but he wasn't done. The room was heavy with silence. Some guests looked down, reflecting. Others stared, unreadable. Then slowly, something changed. A woman near the front nodded, a quiet sign of respect. A man who had smirked earlier now sat straighter, his expression serious. James continued, his voice strong. I don't stand here asking for approval or validation. I stand here because I've earned my place, just like everyone else in this room. A murmur ran through the crowd. James let it settle. I know, some of you laughed, whispered, assumed things about me before I even spoke. His tone wasn't angry, just honest. And that's okay, because change doesn't happen overnight. It happens in moments like this, when people finally stop and think. A pause. James exhaled slowly. He wasn't here for acceptance or to prove anyone wrong. He was here to tell the truth. And the truth was sinking in. At the front table, Richard Langley was no longer smirking. His fingers tapped against his glass, his expression unreadable. James met his gaze. The world is changing, he said, and it's changing with or without permission. Silence. Then, a single clap. Another. The applause grew, real and unforced. James stood still, letting the moment breathe. This wasn't just another gala, it was a shift, a realization. The room had changed. Even those who laughed earlier sat with their thoughts now. The joke had lost its charm. James glanced at Langley one last time. The older man sat motionless, no clever remark left. James stepped back from the microphone. Mr. Reed. Caldwell shook his hand. That was something this room needed to hear, he said. James nodded. No gloating, no celebration, just truth. As he left the stage, a woman whispered, "Thank you." A man gave him a respectful nod. James acknowledged them but didn't linger. He walked toward the exit, head high. Behind him, the gala continued, but the air was different. Conversations had shifted, assumptions had cracked. James didn't need to stay. He had already made his mark. As he stepped into the cool night, he knew this wasn't just about a speech. It was about something bigger. A conversation had begun, and no one in that room would forget it.